I think this panel needs a little further introduction than welcoming Sarah Nuttall, Leo Lee, Achille Mbembe. We've heard from each of them already this week, and I look forward to an engaging session. Sarah, do you want to begin?
I could do, yeah. Thanks very much, David. What I'd like to do with my 10 minutes is really to reflect on an accumulating conversation that I think has been happening since we started. And I want to take it as given that most of the cities we work with, and particularly now speaking from where I'm located, Johannesburg, we have a city which is surging and decaying at the same time. And it's really the complexity of trying to account for that that is part of the work that we undertake. But if you just bear with me, I would like to just reflect in three parts. The first part, returning to the question that I think David asked at the very beginning, which is what sort of critical theory should we be pushing for, could we be pushing for in the context of the question of design? And I just want to go back over that question, given our conversation in the first 3 days. So just to remind ourselves, I think what we're working with is how to take something or something we think we already know and to make it unknown. And I wanted to emphasize this project in the context of some comments that people have made about whether we ought to be using Western theory to think about Shanghai, to think about China. And I want to suggest that in the context of design, and if we take design as a critical principle of how we do critical theory, that question ought to fall away to a large extent. Because if we're undertaking the process of using and reusing things, of remaking them and recycling them, of taking bits and pieces that we need, that we can't afford to lose, that we need to reuse in order to try to see cities such as Shanghai, Mumbai, and Johannesburg, then what we're really engaged in is a planetary conversation in which we're making something, in which something gets made, in which we're trying to create a critical conversation that is sustainable, but imaginative and original at the same time. In that context, residues, incommensurabilities, and rehabilitations enable us to undo given or familiar critical genealogies and to open up conversations in unexpected ways. So it does strike me then that it makes an awful lot of sense to use and reuse whatever it is that we want to take from so-called Western critical theory, to recycle it, reuse it and remake it in the context of Shanghai. So I would like to put that to you, and I'd be very interested to hear from the smaller groups, what you think about that. And part of what we're trying to do is to, on the one hand, defamiliarize concepts that we think we know, right? So for instance, art doesn't have to be in art galleries, and objects don't have to be bought and sold. Similarly, I think secondly, what we're trying to do is really take from the language of the ecological, which is becoming, I think, the dominant language of the planet, but is dominated by the sciences, and to reuse those concepts like recycling, imaginatively. And my last comment on that is I think that's where we actually are in terms of critical theory at the moment, that we find that we're working at the limits of Marxism, postmodernism, etc. And in fact, what we're doing is reusing, recycling, remixing a bunch of critical theories, but we haven't been able to give it a name. It seems to me that some of the debates around design help us to give it a name. And I want to speak for a minute from the context of Johannesburg, where I work, which is to say that if you look at the way in which that city has been studied, South African urban studies have been tossed between, on the one hand, a kind of left Marxist critique, which wants to caricature the present city in terms of the binaries of the past. So Marxism, on the one hand, is an explanatory model for this place, a description of the present as just as divided, segregated, and so on as the past. And on the other hand, a form of post-structuralism, which wants to insist that spaces and identities are always unstable. And what I want to point to, and I hope this is useful for the thinking about Shanghai, is the limits of both of those models. And in fact, what is demanded of us as people who work on the urban is something much more. And when I think about what that more is, I think it's really to pay closer attention to the moments when something gets made. And that's completely consistent with the subject of design. That is really our subject during these two weeks. To pay closer attention to the moment when something gets made in order to, in our context, try to understand, what's coming next? What is the after apartheid? In some ways to relegate the past to its place, instead of to resurrect it at every moment, to make it the kind of theology of the present, the hermeneutic theology of the present. So it's a process of unmaking a persistent optic received from the past through a process of thinking about what gets made. And what I'm invoking there is not so much, as you can hear, a process of deconstruction as the more difficult, analytically speaking, process of reconstruction. How do we begin the process of reconstruction and finding a critical language for that? The second point I'd like to make this morning is to take up the question which was asked yesterday in one of the small groups, which is, is Shanghai paradigmatic? Why should we think about design from Shanghai? And my response to that is really this, that, let's think about a city as an idea. We so often think about it as a problem, as a crisis, but let's think for a moment as a city as an idea. And if that's true, if we can think about a city as an idea, then every major city needs its big idea. And I think that big idea is an invention. It's something we invent. And this is the second proposition I really want to put and want to hear from the small groups about, if possible, is that, we may as well, to some extent, think about design from Shanghai, but we ought to be thinking about it from Shanghai in ways that travel and translate and help us to understand other cities. And for those of us who are working in the South, I think what we're looking for are ideas about cities that can be used to rethink cities in the North as well. In other words, we're looking to deprovincialize a set of critical conversations and to invoke ideas that are original and good and can travel. So it seems to me that part of what we're trying to do here, without being sort of arrogant or assuming anything, is to invent Shanghai as a city of design. And Akbar and others have given us good reason as to why we should think about Shanghai as a city of design. But as I've been trying to say, I think that design travels as a critical concept towards other cities and helps us to see things that we haven't seen before. Let me comment very briefly on working on Johannesburg, which I've done for the last 5 years with Achille. And to say, and here to come back to a rubric I talked about at the beginning, that the kind of big idea, if you like, that we tried to develop in relation to Johannesburg was that, here's a city with a surface and an underneath. Let me just sort of speculate on that a little bit. Johannesburg wouldn't exist if it wasn't for a history of gold mining. And underneath the city are a series of tunnels where people have dug for gold, right? So here we have a city with an underneath based, on the extraction of gold, which is a particular interest to historians, but based on, more substantially, a labor system based on race and original violence, if you like. So a kind of psychic underneath, a historical and a psychic underneath, which structures the life of this city. But an ongoing tension in the history of Johannesburg between the apparent fixity of race, of a labor system defined on the basis of race, and the perpetual unfixing of the commodity form. So you have the play of the surface and the underneath all the time. Now, again and again, people have read this city, the city where I work and live, and the city I think about, in terms of the depth explanation. Okay? Again and again, it's been kind of Marxist modes of reading, as opposed to shallow liberal explanations, which have been used to think about this city. And the surface of the city has been taken again and again as the site of repressed meaning only. So think about sort of Jameson's idea of the political unconscious. Where what's interesting about a text, what's interesting about a city, is what it represses. Okay? Its silences, its invisibilities, the migrant labor system which is hidden beneath the city. Now, Johannesburg's most famous artist is William Kentridge, and probably his most famous image is of the quintessential mining engineer who's sitting at his desk having his morning coffee. And he pushes down his coffee plunger. But instead of stopping at the bottom of the coffee plunger, the plunger goes down through the table, through the floor, and plunges into the stopes, the mining stopes underneath, until it hits the bodies of mine workers who are mining gold under the city. This is the quintessential image of the depth explanation, the Marxist explanation, the critique of the liberal, as I say, the liberal shallow explanation, that if we understand the relations of production which shape a city, we will understand the true nature of that city itself. Now, this symptomatic reading, of course, has its genesis in metaphor and allegory, which is something we've been talking about. It's a theological reading, where the theology in this case is apartheid, and Marx to some extent, and Freud to some extent. Okay. Now, in fact, of course, what that explanation failed to do was to explore anything about the desires of people who actually lived in the city. Okay, now, very briefly, I have only a few minutes left. If you look at the work of contemporary artists in Johannesburg, what they're really starting to do, and this is the key point that I want to make this morning, is to take the surface seriously as an analytical space. Okay? So, the problematic that's facing us, and may well be facing you, if you think about how to deal with the past in the making of the city in the present, is how to get away from always reading apartheid back in, always reading the past back in, always reading the death explanation back in, always reading trauma, the traumatic explanation back in order to describe the present. So what these artists are doing, for instance, is flooding their canvases with the color pink. Let's just take one example. And fiddling with that surface. One particularly interesting example is an artist who inserts into the surface of the canvas a plastic wound. And I wondered if we could just think about that for a moment. It's not a real wound, it's not the real site of trauma, it's a fake object, which has haunted our discussions all week. It's a manufactured object. And it becomes more and more difficult to have recourse to metaphor, to the wound, the trauma, the referential connection, the singular meaning, the metaphorical and allegorical meaning. So what we do is we play along the surface. We work with the literalness of the wound. But at the same time, of course, it's impossible not to read it as a wound, so that its literalness becomes spliced with its connotations as metaphor, as symptom, as the wound of apartheid, of racial segregation. Okay, so just to conclude this section, I think how we might read cities, speaking from Johannesburg, is along a volatile mix of surfaces and underneaths, okay? Psychic wounds and horizontalities, which really try to refuse the return to the singular meaning, to look for fugitive meanings along the surface, to produce thingness, which is not fully inscribed or graspable. So to think about design and thingness along a set of surfaces, and to begin to articulate the surface as a powerful analytic space for reworking the past. If you look at the work of the Komarovs, you look at the work of almost all cultural critics, the surface is taken analytically as provisional, superficial, trivial, etc. And I think what I've been arguing for throughout this week is that we now take it seriously as an analytic space, and that the concept of design helps us to do that. My very last point, and I'm watching the clock at the back, is to do with style, because I think that there's a kind of segue between design and style. And to think for a minute from the point of view of the African body, the young black African body in a city like Johannesburg, to alert ourselves again to the duplicities and complexities of style. For example, a kind of essentialized style that makes for a perfect kind of primitivism. Notions of black style are black things, and the way in which we relook at bodies as objects, but also as things, as objects of design. And not for a minute to think that we get away from the kinds of essentializing and looking that produce particular kinds of black bodies in the city. I think that the challenge here, and this will be my concluding comment, is that, again and again, theorists kind of anthropologize young black bodies, so that if they think about the ways in which young black women in Johannesburg have transactional sex, because they require certain kinds of commodity objects. So they have a range of men who they sleep with in order to acquire the accoutrements, the accessories of urban life. But, you know, we think about them as increasingly as kind of these bodies as transactional objects. And really what we need to do is to start to think about bodies that think and feel, to remember bodies that do also think and feel. So just the question of how to reanimate humans, human beings, that we've turned into objects of study, I think, to turn them back into their full rendering, not only as things, but to draw towards us, of course, another side of all things, including human bodies which inhabit the cities that we've been looking at, but we're not talking about, you know, all that much. So, look, I just want to conclude by saying that I think that design and the critical purchase of design is the most exciting thing that I've come across since postmodernism. And I think that we need to push, and I hope that you will be able to, push to its limits the kind of critical possibilities, the possibilities for reanimated humanities that I think that we're sitting on and that we now need to work with. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah, for the wonderful set of provocations and challenges which we intend to keep before us as we move through the morning. Leo Lee.
I thought I would talk a little bit about Hong Kong, which is now becoming my home city. But having just listened to Anne's talk, I feel very excited by it because her last sentence is precisely what I'm doing now, is to reanimate the human beings as they're in Hong Kong. In fact, I'm going to give a series of lectures precisely on that topic at the University of Hong Kong, Akbar's old alma mater. So I find myself following the footsteps of Akbar Abbas, having just written a book on Hong Kong called City Between Worlds. And the comparison, as Mr. Keys just suggested to me, the comparison between Hong Kong and Shanghai has been constantly in my mind since years ago. I wrote a book on old Shanghai, Shanghai in the 1930s, called the Shanghai Modern. And I now just wrote a little sort of travel book on Hong Kong in the present. I think what unites the two cities, of course, is the colonial background or semi-colonial background. In Hong Kong, you have the British colonial influence. In Shanghai, it's somewhat more complicated. You just toured the French concession yesterday. You have the English and the French influence. I'm trying to combine these two influences and ask the question, especially vis-a-vis my Hong Kong students, what does it mean to do post-colonial studies in Hong Kong, in a post-colony? I find in practice, most of my younger colleagues in Hong Kong are doing what might be called the local studies, the social networks, the various segments of the Hong Kong people, etc., but not as much as what this conference is all about, that is design. Somebody asked me yesterday to talk more about design, and I begged her pardon because I really don't know enough about design, but from my own very, very limited understanding, again, using Hong Kong as an example, I would say that if you link up design with architecture and consider the sort of larger concept of design as something like city planning, Hong Kong is in shambles. There's not much of a city, there's no vision, no plan, nothing. But if you take design in small portions, so to speak, especially emphasizing the surface, I'm considering all the responses to my lecture yesterday carefully, then much can be said about reading between the lines precisely in the kind of superficial science that you see all over Hong Kong. So in many ways, those of you who have been to Hong Kong, you can immediately struck, as I was in my first visit, that Hong Kong was indeed an empire or an island of science, many science, in two languages, sometimes three, because now more and more you have more visual science, human figures and photographs, etc., etc. But often when I first went to Hong Kong, I was struck by the punning between the Cantonese or Cantonese style Mandarin, written Chinese, and English, sort of with colonial traces. if you put these together, you really have a richness of a kind of urban text, all on a superficial level, which affords to me, very profound meanings. I often like to cite my own mistakes. One such mistake was that as a modern Chinese literature scholar, I saw a sign selling suitcases and bags called a Mandarin Duck. And I thought, my gosh, Hong Kong is really a learned city because those people are reading the novels of Mandarin ducks and butterflies. Of course, that's a species of fiction invented in Shanghai for the local Shanghai people in the 20s and 30s, which carried on all the way to Hong Kong, in fact. Of course, I was dead wrong. I was told that it's an Italian-made firm. So you can read a lot of things like this, but very few people are doing it. I find myself very lonely. Maybe Akbash can share my feeling, and also reading photographs, the images purposefully strung onto the newspaper advertising pages. Now the big thing, as always, is housing, selling housing. So this links my sort of reflections on design as some kind of spectacle of science with the Hong Kong housing. To me, nothing gives better illumination than the typical Hong Kong urban housing for residents. Here, of course, economy, cultural studies are combined together. Most Hong Kongers, middle-class Hong Kongers, usually like to buy two houses. One, perhaps to living or to have their parents to living, and the other house for market value. In other words, you can sell it since the banks do not offer you any interest. So you buy houses, that kind of a market value. So everybody's into buying housing, so you go into that. So gradually, residential housing in Hong Kong on this level, sort of a middle class level, are basically for resale and not for living. So that if you go into the interiors, the design is atrocious. A totally uninventive use of space. Always two bathrooms, not one. Even for a very small kind of a house or apartment building. So why? Because two bathrooms always sell better than one bathroom flats. And then, of course, a lot of doors and windows and little balconies here and there, some kind of useless decoration. So almost everything you see goes against the prevailing theory of architecture and design, from whatever school it seems to me. So who are the victims? I think are not the magnates, not the salespeople, but of course your average man and woman families who want to buy houses. But of course, sometimes they will go for even the consumers will go for the same issues. But I talk about sort of architectural voices and critical voices from the architectural arena. Let me cite another example as a kind of a more positive evidence. In the month of September, there will be an architectural festival, small scale in Hong Kong, consisting of this one group that Abbas knows very well, Matthias Wu and his whole company. So they're doing gallery exhibitions, performances, skits, films, forums, etc., just to draw the attention of the average Hong Konger to their housing problem, to have a kind of a general awareness, or shall we say, general architectural awareness. Matthias has written several books. In fact, he's much more fierce in his criticism of Hong Kong housing than I am. So this is what I've learned. In other words, in some ways, our contemporary concerns in what might be called a postmodern globalized world, I sometimes mix up the two concepts together. And in our sort of everyday lives, when we think about some of the issues in the specific moment and in the specific context, in my case, Hong Kong, I find a richness for critical theory and a richness for reflection. And yet, very interestingly, some of my younger colleagues are so interested in doing sort of a political engagement. I mean, anyone who has been in Hong Kong, you can see that, the sign of a good radical scholar is to march on the streets and to do active social work and to march on the streets. I applaud that stance. But sometimes when they do intellectual work or scholarly work, they tend to follow most of the fashionable Western models, especially in theory. To me, there's a dearth of what I would call original native theory. Of course, having said that, I can say that the very definition itself is baloney, it's false, because Hong Kong has always been a mixed culture from the very beginning. If you trace that to 1841, when the British first landed, Hong Kong was not a barren island, but it was basically populated by illiterate peasants. So the English brought, so to speak, literary culture to Hong Kong, and yet it became quickly absorbed by the native culture. So that process of absorption constituted the kind of a native resistance. So it's a kind of a paradoxical. They will absorb some of the English styles of life and turn that into native stuff. My prime example is Nai Cha, milk tea. I mean, this is basically a colonial custom, a colonial tea, but it turned into a local Hong Kong drink. It is available almost everywhere. And yet, most of the people who are concerned with the present, with the current crisis and current problems, do not think back about their collective memories and about their history. So I'm trying to offer a kind of a multidimensional or a way of thinking which takes advantage of current theory and also takes advantage of cultural history and cultural memory to see whether the past indeed intervenes in the present and vice versa. Like Appa, I'm becoming increasingly influenced by Benjamin. In fact, I was so foolish as to carry a whole Benjamin book, the big arcade project, and led a group of 70 people and indeed walk along Queens Road Central, from one shopping mall. I did that from one shopping mall, Admiralty, from the colonial bastion, Pacific Place, all the way to the local market shop in Causeway Bay. In fact, these 70 people, there were very few students. Most of them were just local residents. Never even heard the name of Benjamin. They said, what is this book? So one housewife nailed me down, asked me to explain this book, and I did it in 2 hours in a little coffee house. I consider this to be my greatest achievement in my 5 years of Hong Kong education. Having offered a Benjamin seminar in which some of my grad students and I read about 300 pages of this 1,000-page book, word by word. So now why do I do such a foolish thing? I think it's basically to dramatize a certain sort of concrete relevance. In other words, we take certain things literally. When you talk about flaneur, can we in fact become flaneurs in Hong Kong? It's almost impossible unless you walk on this narrow road now called Queens Road Central, which is now getting narrow. I want to try to do the other way, to do the walking, to go through your typical sort of the Tianqiao, the overpasses or the underpasses. And I got stuck. I could not walk from Central to Causeway Bay. I got stuck by the traffic. So in a way, local planning, urban planning, makes it almost impossible for the Benjaminian flaneur to roam around the city. So if that's the case, what is the rest of Benjaminian illuminations or reflections? So I take Western theory, whatever little theory that I'm reading, to be points of intervention and also points of reflection. I guess, in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say, whether it is Hong Kong, whether it is Shanghai or Mumbai, I think cities are concrete points of intersections and also concrete points of connections. Not only connections between urban cultures, but also connections with history, with theory, with a lot of other things. So I think what we're doing is a very richly rewarding. It's just that we need everybody to join in, including people in architecture and design. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Continuing the provocations, Achille.
Okay, David will be checking on the time. I would just like to, let's say, follow on the footsteps of Sarah and Lee. And first of all, make the following proposition, that a good critical theory of design, if such a thing exists, or if such a thing has to be invented, will be a theory that avoids the pitfalls of both localism and exceptionalism. That's one point I take from listening to Sarah and Professor Lee. It is, or it will be, a theory that goes and looks elsewhere in order to better understand the local, if you want. In a gesture of defamiliarization, and in the full understanding that a real city, I'm using those terms very polemically, is always a city that has its elsewheres. And that, in fact, most interesting cities are those which have their elsewheres and which are not necessarily aware of their existence or fully conscious of the existence of these elsewheres. And in that sense, I think Sarah and Lee, I agree with them in arguing that cities are basically interstitial spaces which connect, of course, their immediate environment to faraway places, while internalizing histories and realities originating from elsewhere into their own myths and their own fables. If we see things in that perspective, then we will be able to recast some of the debates Lee introduced us to yesterday. For instance, Rem Koolhaas and all these Chicago firms, are they really designing China, or are they designing themselves in the guise of China? Now, the second point I would like to make is that if we agree that all cities have their elsewheres, and we draw the implications of this statement in terms of our methodologies and theories, then we have to also accept that, to use a Deleuzian term, they have their lines of flight. And that what is really interesting, what a critical theory of design might help us to, that's its primary object, would be there for the ethnography and the interpretation of these lines of flight. And in that sense, I mean, I would be, for instance, interested in basically studying Shanghai in Johannesburg, for instance. At an age when China, as a rising power, to use your term, is expanding into the African continent. What is it that the idea of a Beijing in Kinshasa or a Shanghai in Johannesburg, what might it yield if we take seriously these idea of lines of flight? So that's the first thing I would like to contribute to the discussion this morning. The second thing has to do with what seems to me to be absolutely critical to, let's say, the life of cities in this age of globalization. Both of you alluded to this. Something which is central, which is the relationship between what we could call the stylization of cityscapes and the movements of capital. If I speak from Johannesburg, where I live, where we have done some work with a number of colleagues, the city is undergoing a massive spatial restructuring. And the new urban spatial restructuring is driven as much by the state as by private developers, real estate capital, architects and designers, in a place that has become a product that is marketed and transacted, that the city has become a commodity in the global competition, in the age of global competition. And as such, its representational form has become ever more stylized. That as, let's say, you take Paris, Amsterdam, Lima or Buenos Aires, if as a city you want to compete in this new global arena, you have to undergo a process of stylization because the city has become a commodity. So I would like to say that, and it seems to me that it is not peculiar to Johannesburg or to Shanghai, that in fact during the last half of the 20th century there has been somewhat of a global homogenization of cityscapes worldwide. We were coming here, I mean, we stopped in Dubai. Of course, it's massive, it's like a souk and all of that. But besides the artificial palm trees and the rest, the airport is really not that different from Zurich. Highway systems are more or less the same. Downtown skyscrapers, forms of work and leisure. All of these look more or less the same the world around. And these developments are concomitant with the dominance of media and high technology centers and new theaters of consumption, in which space and images are both figural forms and aestheticized commodities. So, and that's the other point I would like to make, that a critical theory of design will be a critical theory that will deal very seriously with the question of technology and of the visual. And Lee, you mentioned that yesterday, the way in which some skyscrapers here are built with material that is makes them secure, much more secure than the Twin Towers in New York, that they could resist somewhat, that kind of. So technology, engineering, coming hand in hand with matters of security, which it seems to me is an element we have to look into, the ways in which design and securitization or militarization, to use a term used by David in Johannesburg the other day, indeed go hand in hand. I mention this because I have the feeling that capitalism itself has moved, and we haven't really taken this, or we are only beginning to realize it now. I mean, reading people like Benjamin, like Krakow, and reading Zimmel, that capitalism itself has moved into a place in which the cultural forms and the cultural meanings of its outputs are critical, if not dominant elements of its productive strategy. They are no longer just ornaments or stylistics. That we are somewhat forced to read the aesthetic, semiotic or stylistic attributes of city forms as capital itself, as well as effects of wealth wealth as wealth itself. I could go on and on the question of wealth, but which you raised yesterday. Sarah mentioned it too. I hope that it will be picked up in our discussion. Let me just mention two things, and then I'll stop. Speaking from Johannesburg and relating to the theme of this morning, decaying cities or surging cities, I would say, I agree with Sarah that in Johannesburg, the city is undergoing a twin process, both of decay and of renewal, if you want. And that this process is underpinned by what has been what I would call the splintered histories of Johannesburg. But I believe that most modern cities have splintered histories. In the case of Johannesburg, these splintered histories were, let's say, race as such was a major vector in the constitution of these splintered histories. Race meaning what? Race meaning that black people, for instance, were not supposed to belong to the city. They had to leave the city in the evening at 5 o'clock. Out of here, you go and live in the townships. And in order to enforce these forms of separateness, apartness, to institute these walls, some degree of militarization of the city and of design was required. So far so that after the end of apartheid, the big question in terms of designing or redesigning South African cities is how to democratize them. Therefore, the important issue of the relationship between design and democracy. In an age when, indeed, the desire to live apart from each other is so evident. I mean, this year, 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. How many walls have been erected since the fall of the Berlin Wall? We live in a world of walls, in cities in which most people don't want to live together, which is, in fact, the antithesis of the very idea of the city, a meeting place of strangers. So it seems to me a critical theory of design has to indeed engage these political questions, which I have formulated very broadly in terms of, on the one hand, questions of wealth, what is it, what are its effects, and questions of democracy, which imply, of course, questions of freedom, beginning with the freedom of movement, but also, as you remember, questions of happiness. Because I'll end it there, when you read most philosophers of modernity, the big question underlying the question of modernity is what? How to be happy. The idea being that happiness has been lost somewhat. And you have different answers to that question of happiness. Hegel will tell you, okay, we are unhappy because somewhat we forgot that we were of divine essence. Nietzsche telling you, if you want to be happy, kill him, kill God, and take his place. So that question of happiness, it seems to me, is if you want, the metaphysical, ontological dimension of all what design is all about. And that we have to go into these areas if we want indeed to reanimate the humanities, as Sarah and Leo have told us a moment ago. And that's it.